and arguments about what rights mean and who gets to do what and what the government is allowed to do and not do, that's a really powerful thing. But it's also very different from other independence and revolutionary movements around the world. Like, as the British government, who I will freely admit misjudged so many things along the way to independence, look at this from afar, I suspect that they would look at it and say, you guys are going to have a revolution about tea and taxes? Show me the people who are being imprisoned and are being hurt and having their actual individual rights taken away. Like, who's starving here? Who's really suffering on a very deep level? Whereas what the suffering that the revolution understood was the suffering that comes from a government that is, as they understood it, reaching beyond its power.
So Dr. Byles, do you want to make your case for school children as to why the Loyalist cause was the right cause to support? This is your time, your chance. Clear up any misconceptions. We are so, as you mentioned earlier, we're so focused on the Patriot cause.
Right. I think I would just want to emphasize, and hopefully it's been clear from our discussion so far today, that us Loyalists loved our country as much as anybody else, believed that this was the right thing to do, and that being a Loyalist and being part of Britain meant that you were under British rules, which already meant that the king was not in massive charge, and that, to be honest with you, Boston had an advantage of being so many thousands of miles away from London, so was often quite left alone, honestly. And that actually, if you appreciated that stability, there are a lot of big questions you need to answer about, jumping into the unknown and what is life going to be like as an independent country, which for me is, there are way too many questions to make that feel like it's a sensible thing. And we're already getting our rights as British subjects. So I don't see any reason or any safe and logical reason to threaten that in any way. And it's worth, to finish off that thought, thinking about the fact that the reason the revolution happened, I think, and General Knox would agree with this, that the reason the revolution happened is because those big leaders of the revolution saw that they had rights that came to them because they were English, right? And because those rights were being threatened, that led to revolution, which already tells you that being a British subject gives you the rights and protections that we already have. And what they're asking for actually is taking those certainties and those rights, not necessarily taking them away, but certainly threatening them and prioritizing the individual and threatening the structures of society. And all of that seems way too dangerous to me.
Do you think liberty can endure in this new nation?
I think I've probably made it clear that the British system of government with its, you guys here nowadays have a written constitution, and in Britain they have an unwritten constitution. And I would say the reason for that being a good thing is that it's easier to fix than something's already set down. So already saying that, the short answer to your question is yes, I think it can. Yes, I would prefer a system which doesn't write those things down and make them more difficult to protect in the long run. But if people are able to balance both their individual rights and their commitments to society, then there's no reason why liberty cannot endure in this new country.
And what about you, Knox? Do you think liberty can endure in this new nation?
I think, first of all, that was very eloquent, Doctor. You're always such a good speaker. What year were you born again?
1706.
1706.
Some people think 1707.
You're older and wiser than I am, so that was a very eloquent answer. I thought it was beautiful. I didn't know that about the unwritten constitution. I'll have to look that up.
You don't believe me?
No, I do believe you. Yeah, I have to look it up and make sure you're not spinning a yarn here.
So unlike me.
Yes, I think that liberty can endure in this new nation as long as there are people that are willing to speak out, willing to take a stand, willing to take a little risk for what they believe is right, and to also to love and support your fellow countrymen. As long as these sort of ideas are in the hearts and minds of the people, I think that liberty can endure. And I know that's a bunch of vagary, but that's how I feel.
I think this is fantastic. Thank you both so much for starting this conversation. And now it's your turn to ask questions. So I'm going to start with some questions that we've received so far. So please keep them coming into the chat. Again, if you're going to put a question into the chat, please send over your name, your grade, and the school that you're from. Callie would like to know why your hats are shaped like that.
That is a really good question. Kelly?
Callie,
that's a great question. One of the things that made these hats so popular in the 18th century was the prevalence of being in urban spaces and the powdered wig. These hats that we wear, we often today call them like tricorn hats or tricorner hats. Although I believe in the 18th century, it would have more often called a checked or a cocked hat. And it's kind of a simple farming hat, just with the sides kind of pinned up. And one of the things that made these hats so popular was that these hats, if you're in an urban space, you're oftentimes taking your hat off for various reasons, and hats like this are much easier to carry around under an arm. So that's one of the factors that made these hats so popular. Also, because you might have noticed, they also look fantastic. They look absolutely cool. I think that they're going to come back in a style very soon.
I can only hope.
I won't hold my breath on that one.
You have anything bad about the hats, Doctor?
No. You did a superb
Great
job.
question, Callie.
They're pretty awesome. Remy at St. John Paul II Catholic School wants to know how old you were at the start of the revolution, how old both of you were at the start of the revolution.
So I was born in 1750, and I was born July 25th, 1750. I was born very close to where South Station in Boston, Massachusetts is today. There is a plaque. It is now a gym, but that was where I was born. And so I was about 19 or 20 years old when the Boston massacre shooting happened, and I would have only been about 25 years old when I was commissioned into the Army as a captain. And so I was actually the youngest general in the Continental Army.
So when you study history, one of the skills you have to develop is a sense for which information is correct and which documents are the ones you're going to believe and seem most likely to be true. I say this because there is some dispute as to whether I, Dr. Byles, was born in 1706 or 1707. Nonetheless, that means that by the time 1775 rolled around, I was certainly in my late 60s, and part of the reason that they placed me under house arrest and didn't ship me off to some other part of the world is partly because I was a popular punster and loved public figure. But also because, and I was, well known for my sermons, and people used to like me to speak at certain occasions. But nonetheless, part of the reason that I was placed under house arrest rather than having a more severe punishment is because I was already 70 or so years old in 1776. So by the time I was tried the following year, that's how I ended up staying in Boston, being that rare thing, a loyalist in Boston at the time of the Revolution.
Doc, do you have any insight on what you did during your house arrest to keep yourself entertained?
So I will tell you one little story. So my house arrest in total lasted 2 years. For 2 months, that included a guard, my observatory, as I mentioned. Remember, Tory means loyalist.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't say good sense of humor. nonetheless, so it got to quite a ridiculous situation where I asked the sentry, the soldier who was guarding me, imagine the scene, like he's paid to pace up and down outside my house all day long. So I asked him, would he mind going to the to fetch water from the well? And inevitably he says no, and somehow or another I managed to convince him to say, look, I will guard myself. So you go and get the water, I'll march up and down with the gun. And that's actually how I managed to get water. Beyond that, yes, I was at home, and I actually connected to Henry Knox being a bookstore, which is how we knew each other well, because it turns out that actually my family library stretched to something like 1,800 books.
Wow.
So I could well imagine I spent most of that time thinking deeply, writing little poems, and reading from my quite massive library.
Well, thank you for sharing. Henry Knox, we have several questions for you about your service in the
Sure.
war. So let me try to consolidate these because there's a lot. Luca and Gus from BTU School have read about you.
Hey, Luca and Gus.
And they want to know if it's true that you like guns and cannons. On that line, Leo, in grade 5 from Port Washington, New York, wants to
Leo.
know, Mr. Knox, is it true you had to get a cannon out of the water?
Oh, yes, this is true. So one of the things that I'm really famous for is what they call the noble train of artillery. When the American Revolution started, there were thousands of British soldiers stationed permanently in Boston. So Boston was like this hub of British soldiers. And one of the first things that General Washington wanted to do was to free Boston from British control. And a fort in New York had been captured called Fort Ticonderoga. It's a pretty famous fort. There were 60 tons of captured British artillery there. All these British cannons are sitting up there, and General Washington wants those cannons to be brought down to Massachusetts to force British soldiers out of the city. And so I get the job of transporting all these cannons 300 miles-ish from New York down to Boston during the middle of winter. We used oxen, which Dr. Byles would have criticized their weight, I know. We also used things like wooden sleds to transport all these cannons in the middle of winter. It was, I think oftentimes when people think of serving in the military, they think of like battles and gunfire and like explosions and, drummer boys and all that exciting stuff. But when, my first big task in the Continental Army was really a logistical task. Logistics of moving these huge cannons from a place like New York all the way back down to Boston. And although it was really tough and we did have to pull cannons out of water using oxen, we did do it. We transported these cannons down to Massachusetts, and it was these cannons that helped force British soldiers out of Boston on March 17th, 1776. And that is still celebrated in the county in Massachusetts as Evacuation Day. So great questions.
There's so many fantastic questions. We're going to go real deep now. Are you ready? Liam at St. John Paul II Catholic School, who's in 5th grade, has asked, why couldn't Patriots and Loyalists coexist peacefully?
Wow, this is a great question. Well, my first instinct is like too many weight comments from the other side. It's about my weight. That was one issue no, I'm just kidding. I think that I don't think it's out of the question that if things had played out differently, that there could have been some peaceful coexistence. I just think that tensions were extremely high, and that once gunfire started and people began to be injured and die, like this sort of was a point of no return. However, if things had played out a little differently, if maybe Paul Revere on his midnight ride hadn't warned the colonists, and the British forces were able to confiscate weapons, it's possible that there would have been maybe a more peaceful and equitable sort of compromise between these two forces. I don't think that's I think that is possible, but it's just not the world we live in, you know. What do you think, Doctor?
Wonderful.
'Cause we're getting along pretty well.
Listen, I agree. And
It's only because I'm here. You're only saying it because I'm here.
I really think that you're right, that under a different set of circumstances, we could have had things turn out differently. And the fact that we all are Bostonians and love our country means that we're committed to being here and trying to make it work. The way history played out and lots of different factors means that there ended up being armed conflict. And it's worth probably saying that in the population of Boston, which was about 15,000 at the time of the Revolution, 1 person in every 3 is a revolutionary, 1 person in every 3 supports the king. Right? So that's a lot of people. And in Boston's case, most of those, the rest of my family, for instance, and most of the other loyalists go to where it's safe for them to be, which could have been a lot of places in the world, but in this case ends up being in Canada, which is actually where my children end up, for example. In as much to say that in other places, the loyalists end up staying. So some leave and a lot stay and end up being, Americans after the Revolution. So I think that already indicates the fact that things could have ended up differently. Things that people are always going to have a disagreement. Whether it's going to turn into a war depends on lots of other things. But there is a set of circumstances, perhaps without a lot of the government reactions that you either learn about or will learn about, that maybe it would have stayed on the level of plain disagreement and not gotten any more severe than that.
Thank you. Cora from North Reading wants to know, do you know if Loyalists or Patriots ever switched their sides or beliefs?
Wow, that's a really good question. That's a really good question because, I mean, I'm sure. What's the name of the student again? Sorry.
Cora.
Cora. That's a great question. You know, when you ask like, did a Loyalist or a Patriot ever switch their sides? I think personally that probably definitely did happen. Although this would be like it might have been someone, you know, it might have been maybe their own thoughts or something. I can't really think of anyone off the top of my head who is like a really prominent and outspoken advocate for one side, then switching to the other side. That may have happened, but I'm certain that there were probably lots of people who were maybe not as outspoken one way and then sort of turned their minds, you know, in another direction. Like, for instance, there were multiple instances in the lead up to the American Revolution where like a big event would happen and then prominent American patriots would sort of write about it and spin it to try to convince others to join their side. Like events like the Boston Massacre, 5 people shot in Boston. It's heavily publicized. The funerals are huge events. And it's very likely that, you know, people that may have been at that funeral or read about these things may have been influenced to sort of change their sides. Although, off the top of my head, I don't know of any like super prominent, outspoken loyalists who became patriots or patriots who became loyalists.
Yeah, that is a great question. I also can't think of a specific example of someone who actively switched their thinking, but it must surely be the case that people did. And I think it comes down to what is the big reason or big reasons that you believe what you do? Because I want to make it very clear that us loyalists also don't like the taxes, also quite upset. Hopefully that quote about the tyrants, the 3,000 tyrants, shows that people are frustrated. It doesn't matter what side you're on. People don't like what the king and the parliament are doing. The difference is that we don't come to the conclusion that we should change our government because of it. So that surely must mean, and thanks again for the superb question, that like some people looked at what happened and said, oh, this tax is bad enough for me to actively now become more committed to being a patriot, or they look at it and say, it's not enough for that, and I'm going to remain a loyalist, or vice versa.
This is great. So Henry Knox, this question is just for you. Swan Meadows, 7th grade, would like to know, do you think liberty and freedom are the same thing?
Ooh, that's a superb question.
That is a good question. Do I think liberty and freedom are the same thing? I'm sure you could look up like a dictionary definition and like kind of find out. But when I personally think of these two words, I would say that when I think of liberty, the way it's often used, I would think of liberty as being a freedom, freedom with freedom with civic responsibility. I would say, I guess, is what when I think of liberty, I think of freedom to express yourself politically, to do things like vote, and to do things like to peacefully assemble and protest. This is what I think of when I think of liberty. And so I guess I would say I would think of like liberty as the freedom to civically participate in things like voting and peacefully assembling, to make your voices heard to a government. And I know that probably is like not the dictionary definition. That's just how old Henry Knox sort of interpret it. So great question. Thanks for asking it.
These keep coming. Mr. Hornbeck's class from Brooklyn, New York would like to know, did Loyalists and Patriots have differing views on slavery?
That's a really good question.
Ooh, that's a good question.
That is a good question. So there are definitely there are some very, very outspoken American patriots that are in Boston. And some of them are very anti-slavery. Some of them are abolitionists, but some of them are not only, acquiescent of slavery, some of them are taking part in the institution of American slavery. Folks like John Hancock owned enslaved people, and so they're whether a patriot or loyalist, I don't know of any like sort of, if there's like one side that is more or less abolitionist off the top of my head. Do you know, Dr. Byles?
It's a superb question. Thank you. I'm not sure that I do. Forgive my lack of insight here. I have not found any evidence that Dr. Byles, own any enslaved people, but I can say that as far as I'm aware, my son, Mather Byles Jr., who is famous for being the minister of what is now called the Old North Church, famous because that's where the lanterns were placed at the request of Paul Revere. So on the night of the revolution, he was still the minister of that church. And he, to the best of my knowledge, actually did own an enslaved person, which is obviously evidence of the fact that I don't think we can make a separation based on commitment to the British government or commitment to the revolution as to how you think about issues of enslaving people.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer that question like with 100% knowledge, but I just think that the terrible institution of American slavery was very insidious, and it was very prevalent and common all over the United States, including the Northeast.
It's probably also what just occurs to me to say that both sides, according to there's a famous saying in politics and history, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which led enslaved people to either side on the revolution, because one side was saying, if you fight with us, we'll give you freedom, and certainly Britain was for sure saying that. So it attracted folks according to that argument, but that argument was being made by both sides because it suited them.
Excellent question.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We've gotten some more questions about your clothing, and so I'm going to take one from the EE Little School, the 5th grade classroom.
Hey, EE Little School.
Do Loyalists wear clothing that identifies them as separate from Patriots? So did Loyalists and Patriots wear different types of clothing?
In general, no. Although, so in terms of styles, it's similar. there is talk of certain colors denoting your allegiance, and that green and yellow was taken on as a
You're in the Crips or the Bloods.
particularly loyalist color. But in terms of styles of things, it's pretty much the same. But yes, there was some leaning towards certain
Green
colors.
and yellow, huh? Mm-hmm. Pretty good. Pretty good. Interesting.
But yet you're in blue. It's just, this was what was clean that you had washed for us today.
Absolutely.
Powder blue.
Powdered blue. It's beautiful. Bodie, who's in grade 4 in Marshfield, wants to
Bodie.
know if either of you saw your families, or I guess any family, divided by differences of opinion over the war.
Oh, this is a great question. This is a great, Bodie. That's a fantastic question, and I can tell you from my own personal experience, a little bit, yes. So I was married to a woman named Lucy Flucker. She was from the Flucker family in Boston. They were actually a very prominent Loyalist family, and so after things kind of popped off during the American Revolution, Lucy actually was, she kind of had a big break from her family, and a lot of her family ended up, leaving the New England area. And very fortunately, I was there to take and inherit their large estates. So pretty good deal for me. Probably, but we can see there that she actually had a big split with her family. They were a big, prominent Loyalist family, and they just happen to have, a big house and all this great stuff. And after the American Revolution, they weren't really around anymore. So I was like, oh, I'll take all this, sure, yeah.
Well, that's part of the reason people were so surprised that you turned out to be such a big fan of General Washington and in favor of the revolution.
Yeah.
Don't know where your bread is buttered, do you?
That's true. There was a little bit of moment there where people thought I might go to the other way because I was married to a prominent Loyalist.
Yes. So in my own family, it seems pretty clear that people remained Loyalist. What I can say to sort of add to the intensity of that is that I said that my own children left to go to Canada. That includes Mather Byles Jr., my son, who was the minister of the church we just mentioned. But it is also true that part of the reason that I stayed, yes, I was elderly, but also because I had 2 unmarried adult daughters, whom I stayed with, and we all stayed together in the family house in Boston. Now, which is, I'm going to say a strange sentence now. After I died, they inherited the house from me and actually treated it as an enclave, a little area that was still Britain, in as much as they did not acknowledge the existence of the United States of America. They refused to pay taxes to the government and actually got into a big fight much later in their lives, because they were around until the early part of the 19th century, much later in their life, when Boston decided, hey, we want to buy your house because we want to build a big road right where it is. So they actually had a massive legal fight.
Wow.
Because my daughters, and rightly so, did not wish to acknowledge the government and were not willing to play along with their schemes for for evicting them and throwing them out of class.
Wow.
That
I
is-
didn't know that, Dr. Byles.
That is a fantastic story. Kids Speak Homeschool says, thank you. And they want to know, do you feel there is a difference in the liberties fought for wars today than liberties fought for wars in the past?
Wow, that is a really good question. A difference in the liberties fought for today versus the liberties fought in the
past.
Over that wars are fought over. That's a good question. I think so. I mean, so wars are obviously bad, except for the one we're talking about. That one's fine. The one we're talking about is good. War, obviously is not a good thing. We would obviously want to live in a world without war. So do I think there's like a difference in the liberties that people fought for then versus now? Maybe slightly, but I think that even back then, these conflicts, I think back then, people viewed in a similar way as to they do today. Some folks seem to, spoil for war and to wish it and to want it. Others want to like avoid it at all costs, and others might see war as like some kind of opportunity for some great social change and some way that they can, sort of maybe advance their own personal beliefs. So I would say that the wars that happen today and the wars that we're talking about, obviously, as an American patriot, I fully support the casting off of the chains of this guy's British Empire, no matter what the costs and what we had to do. So I would say, yeah, I think that there are similarities between these, the war we're talking about here and the maybe, I don't know, conflicts that still happen today. But I don't know if I could articulate any kind of massive differences or similarities.
That's a superb question. Thank you again for it. I think that in the case of the American Revolution, as we've kind of touched upon, for the revolutionaries, it's very much about personal liberty, and I guess you could extend that to understanding values of freedom, and I think we can see that those are still values that countries go to war over. However, a lot of the motivations that we know about in this, motivations there could be so many different ones, but there isn't really, as I can tell as I think about your question, an overarching political motivation for the Revolutionary War. Obviously, it is intended to change the status, and that's very political. But in terms of what's pushing people towards that, it's because of the arguments we've spoken about. And I would make the distinction, like I did before, between those individual rights and freedoms that people feel are being taken away from them, and someone from the outside looking and saying, what do you mean? I don't see anybody being imprisoned here. I don't see anybody being hurt here. I don't see that you're doing some violence, which are normally things that lead to wars. So like this war is very much about an idea, which possibly makes it the same but also different from the reasons, or at least some of the reasons that people go to war today.
These are fascinating, and I hope this brings a lot of great conversation into your classrooms. We have time for a couple more questions. Eliana from Boston Public Schools wants to know, were Loyalists and Patriots friends before the war?
Oh, great question, Eliana. I think, yeah, there are probably many cases where people found that where friendships may have become strained or ended because of differing sort of views on the burgeoning American Revolution. I'm sure that did happen. Of course, with Dr. Mather Byles and I, we never really had a real friendship before he began to publicly slander me. But I'm sure that friendships really did end because of differing views on this. And these are things that still happen today and will continue to happen in the future. You can be somebody who has something in common. You can have things in common with friends, but then have differing extreme views, differing views on some issue that might cause a friendship to become strained, or in some cases end entirely. These things happen every day.
Right. And Eliana, great question. As was true then as is now, life is complicated. So the people have friendships with all different people for different things that keep that friendship alive. I can't give you a specific example of one that changed for me over time, but I can say that, for instance, Benjamin Franklin, good friend of mine, to the degree actually that I was actually helpful to his son, wrote him a letter of recommendation. So yeah, we were close friends. So yes, people who disagree with each other can indeed also, and still can, hopefully.
That's so nice. I
maintain
didn't know you
friendships.
knew Franklin that well.
Yeah, we're tight.
Any other revolutionaries you were tight with?
You're not impressed enough, I think.
We did. I would have to find the name, and I apologize to. We had a question asking if either of you knew Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, Alexander Hamilton. Everybody's favorite guy. Everyone loves Hamilton. You know, he used to work for me. He used to be a captain in the artillery when I was a general. And then he ended up basically was going to be my boss in the Washington 2nd Cabinet. And so I did the mature thing and I quit. Quit and I moved to Maine and I got involved in local brickmaking and I got involved in politics, local politics, and I threw my weight around until I choked on a chicken bone and passed away from an infection. So, you know, everybody loves Alexander Hamilton. He's the hot guy. I can't do a show. I can't do raps. So no one cares about old Henry Knox.
I sense no bitterness.
So your feelings towards Alexander Hamilton might be stronger than your feelings towards Dr. Byles?
Oh yeah, I mean Dr. Byles, he's got that great quote, but you know, in terms of Broadway show potential, you know, I don't feel he shows me up. So I quite like Dr. Byles.
So maybe Loyalists and Patriots can find some common ground after all and some civility.
Absolutely.
It has been a joy to be in your classrooms today. Thank you again for the Freedom Trail. It was such a pleasure. Dr. Mather Byles, Henry Knox, thank you so much for your service to our nation, for your thoughtful answers, and for coming into America's schools. If you have any questions, feel free to jump the last few questions in the chat, and we can try to answer them later. We hope that you join us on Wednesday for our next conversation. This time we'll be looking at equality. Again, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Civic Learning Week.
Thanks so much.